In the early 2000s, headlines on plastic accumulating in the North Pacific Gyre soared. Soon, people were talking about a plastic island floating in the Pacific, twice the size of France or twice the size of Texas. But that island never existed. So, what were researchers at the time actually talking about? A recent study estimates that between 0.8 million and 2.7 million metric tons of new plastic pollution enters the ocean every year. For comparison, that is the same weight as 5,300 to 18,000 blue whales, which, if you ask me, is a lot of blue whales. Plastics originate from various sources, but in the ocean, regardless of where they came from, they are transported by currents, and like currents, they are bound to no borders. They are carried across oceans and seas all around the world. And a large percentage ends up in accumulation zones because of physical barriers or currents. Gyres, for example, are a large system of circulating currents that can trap things that enter them. And the largest gyre of them all is the North Pacific Gyre, formed by 4 currents rotating clockwise. This is where the so-called island was supposed to be located. But as the title of this video indicates, that is not the case. In the late 1980s, Charles Moore, a sailor and oceanographer, stumbled upon a vast expanse of plastic debris while crossing the North Pacific Gyre. His observations, initially shared through articles and interviews, catalyzed a growing awareness of ocean plastic pollution. As Moore's story gained traction, other researchers and organizations worldwide began to investigate the scope and impact of plastic debris in the ocean. And through collaborative efforts, expeditions, and scientific studies, the extent of the problem became clear. Actually, what Moore saw during his voyage was more like a soup of plastic rather than an island. Just a bunch of pieces floating around, trapped in this current system. And I don't really know where the term plastic island came from, but because of its misleading title, researchers and most media don't even use that term anymore. We now call it the North Pacific Garbage Patch. But this doesn't mean that we should take it less seriously. During my PhD, I worked with plastic pollution in the ocean, and I even got the chance of participating in a research expedition that passed by the North Pacific Garbage Patch. And these plastics you see here were collected there. And as you can see, they ain't no island. I now want to discuss why having these floating around in the ocean is probably worse for our health and the environment than if an actual plastic island existed. A plastic island, while visibly disturbing, would just be a giant floating object that I doubt anyone could swallow. Smaller pieces, on the other hand, are easily ingested by animals. They need only to open their mouths. We don't really know because it's difficult to estimate the extent of the impact floating plastic pieces have on marine populations. But it is already considered a significant threat for large animals like turtles, marine birds, and cetaceans. And the main culprits, besides fishing gear, are bags, plastic utensils, and balloons. That is why this is a big no-no. Let's not do that anymore. Stop it. Of course, the bigger the ingested pieces, the more likely it is to cause visible physical damage in the digestive system, especially if they accumulate over time. They can block or rupture the gastric tract, or they can provide the animals a false sense of satiation, leading to starvation. But let's not ignore these little guys here. Microplastics is the definition used for plastics measuring between 0.1 and 0.5 millimeters in diameter. And if we go smaller than that, we have nanoplastics. And just to give you an idea of what that size means, these pieces are large microplastics, and they cause a new set of issues. Because they are so small, they are much more easily ingested. I mean, I don't think I will be accidentally swallowing a tire anytime soon while swimming. Microplastics and nanoplastics, on the other hand, I probably already have. They can also cause the same types of damage that bigger pieces do, especially if ingested in enough amounts, depending on the size of the animal and depending on how many pieces the animal eats. But let's talk about something else. Because there is a more invisible threat that might pose a serious risk even to us. They can cross barriers that bigger pieces can't, like tissues, for example. Not these tissues. These are for my allergies. Body tissues. Nanoplastics, for instance, have demonstrated the ability to pass to the bloodstream. And preliminary studies on small mammals suggest that they might pose a risk to our health. This risk stems not only from the potential for physical blockage, but also from the release of chemicals. Because plastics contain a cocktail of additives, which are compounds added during the manufacturing process that have been shown to leach from the plastics into the environment. And studies suggest that some of them can be toxic. For example, bisphenol A, or BPA, which is probably the most extensively studied plastic additive ever, has been banned in certain parts of the world in certain plastic products. However, due to the lack of adequate monitoring and testing methods and tools and resources for research, the broader ramifications of micro and nanoplastics and associated additives on both human health and the environment remain uncertain. Which is not something you probably want to hear. So let's fix that, please. But on the flip side, regulators are starting to consider micro and nanoplastics as a serious threat to human health. And in the near future, I suspect we will see a great deal of research and legislation on this, especially pertaining to concentrations of microplastics and all associated chemicals in things like drinking water and food. But when it comes to micro and nanoplastics already in the ocean, there really isn't much we can do besides do our best to not add more to it. There are numerous initiatives around the world that work towards removing visible pieces from the environment. And we should celebrate them. They are great. Marine life will thank you for that. There are beach cleanups, trash removal, devices in rivers, the invention of fishing.
What?
Micro and nanoplastics, these are quite difficult to remove. And just like their bigger counterparts, they also accumulate in gyres and other accumulation zones. But like, we're talking about the North Pacific Gyre specifically, so they also accumulate there. In fact, when it comes to numbers, smaller plastics are found in higher concentrations than bigger ones. And once ingested by an organism, they enter the food chain, and their effects may be experienced by others beyond the organisms that ingest them. Add these unknown environmental and health risks of ingesting micro and nanoplastics to the not cool list, and you might understand why I think that having plastics floating around is worse than if they were all compacted into a giant island. People still come up to me asking about the plastic island, and I always try to explain to them what I explained to you in this video. The last thing I want people to take away from their conversation with me is that plastic pollution is not such a big issue as they thought it previously was, because this giant island actually does not exist. And whether or not the discourse around this plastic island shaped the way we talk about plastic pollution today, the reality is society in general is more aware that this is an issue, that plastic pollution is an issue. And we even see an uptake in legislations tackling this issue, which is where we should focus a lot of attention, by the way. We should focus much more energy in preventing more plastic from entering the environment in the first place. And with that, thank you very much for watching. Thank you so much to all my Patreons on Patreon for still supporting me, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.